So welcome to another Talking Tech episode. And today I'm joined by Tim Needham, Director of Engineering, who I've known scarily for over a decade. Welcome, Tim. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
No, not at all. Maybe kind of traditionally what we do is a little intro. So perhaps you could do a little intro to you and your background, and we could start from there.
Yeah, sure. So I've been active in the tech software engineering space, 25 years now, I think, professionally. That's a terrifying thought. Classic route, starting out as a graduate, although I did ship straight out to the States, which was an interesting experience, and then a little bit in Europe, back to the UK after that. I've worked my way up through various engineering grades in organizations in both the private and the public sector, with decent exposure to a couple of key industry areas, so education, healthcare, recently in travel and tourism, working in, I would say, in a variety of size teams and organizations, from almost a sort of startup size to really large multinationals, with engineers. I think at the largest I've had somewhere between 150, 160 in the team directly under me. But I mean, it fluctuates, and I've also had periods where I've worn multiple hats at the same time. So dipping in or actually getting quite close to the metal of various projects as well at the same time as, overseeing the health and the growth of the overall engineering function.
And I suppose it's a good segue into what you and I spoke about when I said, would you come on about our experience together has been generally, you in a position where teams are growing, scaling, and we had a chat around having a discussion around scaling teams. And my first question just around that was, how do you know, or when is the right time to scale a team? When do you know that's the perfect time to start?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think there's probably two answers to that, depending on how ambitious you think the scaling needs to be. So there's what I'd call the day-to-day bread and butter scaling. You're in a business that's healthy. You've got let's say an acceptable amount of growth and an ambitious roadmap, and you want to get through that. And generally the indicators are, well, they're based in having good agile process, I would say. Nothing heavyweight, but you need something at the heart that's driving some statistics that you can measure around velocity and predictability of your teams. And at some point you will hopefully have a healthy function that then just starts to struggle just a little bit. Or, it might be a squad, it might be a whole division of the business, but that's usually an indicator that you need to take a look. And providing, there's nothing nefarious bubbling away under the scenes, that's probably the first concrete indicator that you have a roadmap now for that team that's bigger than the team can consume. The flip side of that is when you have the super ambitious project with the crazy tight deadline. And that's when you need to go big. And that's a tricky one to achieve, but not a tricky one to signpost, because it tends to be that the light in the tunnel is actually the oncoming train. You see this thing from a mile off. I had that very recently. We had a very ambitious replatforming project we wanted to do. We wanted to do it very quickly. We knew to do that, even from rough beer map estimations, that we would need a team significantly larger than we had, but crucially also a team significantly larger than we wanted to maintain going forward once we got back to normal times. So that's when you start to think about, okay, we need to do a large scale up. We need to fish outside of our regular ponds. We need to start looking at augmentation partners, outsourcing of some kind, or contractors, but really getting that resource expansion on board quickly and in a way that doesn't, although I'll come back to this, doesn't create too much overhead on the actual healthy operation of the team that you're augmenting.
I know that's something, we've spoken about, the hiring local versus outsourcing, that kind of stuff. But I suppose first and foremost with that kind of growth is, like, what do you prioritize as the qualities you need to find? What are the, during that rapid growth phase, leadership versus tech skill, that kind of, where do you go first?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. So let's go back to the basic question then. In terms of general hiring, you want people who are bright, engaged, enthusiastic. That's sort of your bare minimum. You hopefully it's taken as read that you want people who actually know what they're doing and have some experience in the field. Although sometimes, I've had great success taking a punt. When we've done a lot of hiring in the last 10 years with people who are basically near graduate level, but there's something there, and it's obvious that there's something there when you talk to them. I have a sort of weird view of engineering in that, and maybe it's me, but I always get this perception, certainly when I've been looking for roles throughout my career, that people who are hiring tend to focus a little too much, I think, on must have X years experience of this language, X years experience of this framework or whatever. I think that's fine, but I think that misses a trick. I think there's sort of an abstract idea of engineering programming ability, which then you lay on top of that familiarity with the language. And I'm sure this is a hot take and it will insult a lot of people, but that sort of feels like that final leap is just learning syntax and APIs. A good programmer can program, and okay, there might be an on-ramp to them shifting from, I don't know, Rust to C# or whatever, but it's feasible as long as the desire is there to do that.
Knowing you as long as I have, I don't think you worrying about upsetting people is a big thing anyway. But I think, but it goes back to, like, you're completely right there. But it goes back. The first things you said were like bright and capable, right? So, like as you said, I think a lot of the whether it's internal HR put on a job spec as must-haves, that those first two things, I think you get that from an interview, and a lot of them, as you said, you could take a punt on. But that doesn't necessarily, as you said, if you're trying to scale at speed, that doesn't necessarily meet those requirements.
Yeah. So when we come to the sort of scaling at speed, yes, I want all of that as well. Yeah. But what becomes really important is enthusiasm, engagement, and also the ability to be a self-starter, and culture fit. I think culture fit is absolutely vital, and I'll come back to that. But just talking about self-starter, I think one of the key mistakes, or maybe not a mistake, but one of the pitfalls that I've come across when doing large scaling is, even if you take a sensible estimate at how much of your team's capacity and productivity is going to be lost during that ramp up phase, you're probably still wrong. So when you do a really big scale up, you're almost by definition going to take your best and your brightest off the line almost, and they're going to be your champions for really bringing on these large numbers of resources and bringing them up to speed, educating them on your code base, your systems, your architecture, getting them used to your ways of working, but also really imbuing them with your idea of what that engineering culture is, and that's crucially important. Yeah. And that's why I think culture fit, when you're hiring in general, is really important, because everywhere I've worked, every organization I've come across, there is a culture that sort of either grows organically in there, or it has been sort of deliberately guided and shepherded by someone or some people at the top who are trying to achieve something. And hopefully that's a good culture. So, not necessarily always. Some places I've been, the culture's been quite unhelpful and productive, and we need to change that. But ultimately, if we take the assumption that you've been there a while and the culture's good and it's performing, people are engaged, maybe you're doing NPS scores, so you know that people are happy with how things are. I'm almost at the point now where I think hiring the superstar genius who's going to come in and just disrupt that is just a red flag. Take someone who's maybe 80% of the way there, but is actually going to pull in the same direction. He's going to get along with the team. He's going to help it perform, because we're not in a normal, if we were in a normal expansion phase, you can absorb, a certain number of those people onto a team, and your team will move through that sort of that disruption phase. They'll reform, they'll find maybe the same culture, maybe a new culture that's not too far away, but they will get there. When you're bringing in 40, 50, 60 people in a short space of time because you've maybe got a year to achieve a project, I just don't think you can afford to take that hit. You're already going to lose so much productivity bringing the new people up to speed. You need to try and keep the harmony and keep the productivity and also the good ways of working. A caveat on that, though, is that does assume that you have found all the good ways of working, and you should always have your ears open to someone who comes in as a disruptor and says, "This is great, but just because they want to do something that's different doesn't mean it's wrong." You might decide in the end, actually, that is great, but we don't have the time to implement that on this particular initiative. But maybe we'll pipe it in underneath to our standard ways of working when we come out of that initiative. But generally speaking, you want people who, and I think you can tell in that first conversation, and it comes back to how they present themselves, how engaged they are, and that's also why I think the face-to-face is so important. I might not have said that 5 years ago. I might have enjoyed home working and never having to speak to real people during the pandemic. But I think we've all seen actually that comes with its own set of problems at the other side.
I completely agree, and we're seeing more and more of that with our clients. There's more push to that because I think, especially as teams look to grow at the moment, you need that people interaction. And actually, you sort of did answer part of it. And another question I was thinking of around the, as you said, culture, massive, especially technology businesses that are growing. They're trying to embed that. How do you balance that, the cultural piece, with also trying to structure a team environment, getting in the right leaders? Do you go to first like leadership within before you try and hire outside? How do you structure that team? How do you build that culture moving forward?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So I've been in an environment where there was a leadership change and there was a period of restructuring and out hiring. So anytime a role of any kind of seniority appeared, we went straight to the market.
Right.
I think that's weird. I get it. But I think, if you haven't got people, I can't remember his name, but the guy who set up all of the good practices at GE said, as a leader, as a manager, your first responsibility is to find and train your replacement.
Yeah.
And I think the same is true in, any hierarchical organization, particularly in engineering. You need to be, okay, you might have hit a stable state, but you need to be looking at all of your engineers and saying, okay, who's ready for senior, who's a nudge away from senior with some support, who in the seniors is ready for principal. You always need to be thinking, ultimately, how do we push these people forward? There'll be some people who don't want to. You will always get people who are, I'm a senior engineer, I'll always be a senior engineer until I retire, and that's what I want. But generally speaking, I think there's quite a healthy amount of ambition and competition in engineering teams, and that's good. You want people who are hungry to deliver, hungry to prove themselves in a healthy way. For me, the answer is always, who's in the team? Who have we got? Who have we got who's already in a leadership position? Who have we got who's near to a leadership position? And I've done that a lot, particularly in the last 5 years, identifying people who are ready or are close to being ready for the next step up. And actually, sometimes, even if they're close to being ready, they're not quite the finished article, pushing them up a bit early, with the right support can be what helps them stretch to get to that part. Yeah. So for me, that's always the first port of call. You're not always that lucky, and I haven't always been that lucky. And sometimes you do have to do an open recruitment, particularly if you've got, a leadership position with a specific skill set that you just don't have in the team, or maybe you've already mined the talent as far as you can, but because you're scaling out so far, you need some more squads and more technical leads. So yeah, I don't think we should ever be afraid to look to the market, but I think going there first has, and I suspect that's what you're hinting at, it has that negative impact on the internal culture.
It's quite for me, it's quite a clear statement to anyone internally. You're basically saying, no one's good enough, there's no opportunity, we're going external, which can be just very damaging on cultures, which I've seen. And I think a lot of the scale-ups we've seen view it as, well, no, we're hiring a different department without impact our crown. But I believe,
that's something that really annoys me. So I think there is, here we go, I'm going to start offending people. I think we're all guilty of this. And I don't mean management in tech, I mean everybody in tech. If I had a penny for every person I'd hired who said, I know I'm going to end up in a team, but how long will I be in that team? What's the opportunity for me to move to a different team? Who then never asks to move team? I'd be a millionaire. It's bizarre. I think there's some part of us as engineers that likes to find a comfortable box, as long as it's one that we're happy with having put ourselves in, and then we don't get out of that box.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've always tried to do, and have taken more seriously in the last 4 or 5 years is not just shaping the squads within the team to match the product function in the business, but also committing to revisiting that shape and the people in each squad on sometimes a quarterly basis, sometimes an annual basis. I don't think we should be frightened. And it goes back to what you said. I don't think we should be frightened to say, okay, well, Jeff and Sally are in this team, and so that's where I need them to stay. If I'm standing up a new team, maybe Sally is exactly the right person to lead that team, or maybe Jeff needs a change because he's starting to feel a bit stale. I think that's something that we're guilty of on both sides. People, who I see ask about this regularly and then do nothing about it. It comes up in annual reviews, it comes up in one-to-ones, but then they never say, well, I quite fancy a look at that team over there. And maybe it's because we just get so buried in the work, and it's a very, even if you're not sprinting, it's a very cyclical thing, engineering. So maybe it's just we get locked into the cycle of, okay, well, I'm planning the next sprint, I'm planning the next quarter. I don't know, but I think it's good to mix it up. And I think I understand why businesses don't like that, because you think, well, I've just spent 3 years putting all of this domain knowledge into Steve over here. If Steve goes into another team, I've lost that domain knowledge from where I need it. But the point is, Steve's not left the business, and he's still there to help whoever transitions into that role. And that's stuff you can plan for. You don't have to say, okay, well, as of Tuesday, you start here. You can have a gradual ramp up, and you plan all of these things with a sensible cutover. And hopefully, one of my big bugbears, you've got a decent living set of documentation as well and standards.
Yes, but funny enough, I don't think that is unique to technology. That's in our environment in sales, whether it's a specific geographical location or industry location they work in, like as you said, people at reviews or definitely want to move into this area. It's very interesting, niche. 3 months later, it's never spoken about again, which it is it's an interesting one. So one of the things we touched at the start, we did come back to is, so scaling at speed, you've exhausted potentially actually, before I lead you into a presumptive question, if you've got to scale at speed, what are your views when you're looking at kind of outsourcing versus local versus nearshoring? Like, what are you balancing there when you're looking at scale?
Yeah, I think it is almost. I don't think it's presumptive. I think it is almost accepted that if you're going to go big and go quickly, you're going to need a partner to do that. Unless you seriously have a large enough local talent pool and the capacity and a big enough team to be able to sort of find, stream, screen, and work through all of those candidates. I mean, the thing about going big, going quickly is it doesn't ever really feel like that's a permanent thing. So that it always feels like there's something big we need to do in a short space of time. But after that, we might be the same size we are now, or we might be a little bit bigger. Yeah. So that kind of cuts you off from the permanent talent pool. So as you say, can you get contractors? That's always a good. Contractors, I think, are good if you need a smaller augmentation, because you can sort of handle the effort required to bring them on board. When you want to bring 40, 50, 60 in, I mean, that's almost, okay, we're just going to down tools and just look for 60 people for the next 2-3 months. And that might be worth it, particularly if you've got the budget to do that.
I was about to say that's quite a strain on budget, right?
Yeah. Well, it's a double strain on budget, isn't it? Because you've got almost zero productivity for the time it takes to find these people. And then, with the best will in the world, contractors ain't cheap. There's a reason why the outsourcing model is looked upon favorably by some areas and why it works in some areas. And that's because it's theoretically at least cost effective. Although, that's changed somewhat since the pandemic, but it's still I don't know, if you offshore outsource, I think people still figure on 2-to-1, 3-to-1 in terms of cost. That's probably the right sort of sweet spot. It's going to be less with nearshoring.
But do you potentially sort of with that I'm being quite sweeping with my statement, but do you then take a hit on quality potentially because of the cost saving?
You always take a hit on quality, I think. Probably even with a small contract augmentation, it's not so much to do with the cost saving. I mean, I suppose there is a theory that, service providers maybe don't have access to the best talent pool because the best talent pool have gone somewhere else where they'll earn more money. Maybe that's true. I think the bigger challenge with outsourcing is, and this is my perception, I think a lot of the industry uses them as body shops, which I absolutely detest. I think that, I mean, God, how dissatisfying must that be, if you're on the receiving end of that? But also, how do you ever generate any long-term value? And maybe that's the answer. Maybe people aren't looking to generate long-term value. But, if you bring on a strategic resourcing partner, surely you're thinking of having them around for 5 years at least. So, you want good talent that you can build into the team, but you want to build them into the team in such a way so that your stakeholders, they'll look the same to the stakeholders. It doesn't matter whether it's somebody onshore, whether it's somebody in-house, whether it's somebody offshore. The sort of, if your stakeholders are that far into it, the performance characteristics should look the same. You should be able to hand work off to, this is my theory anyway, you should be able to hand work off to an augmentation resource the same way you would to one of your senior in-house resources. And so that's definitely a challenge I've come across. We did a big augmentation with 50, 60 heads, I think it was, from a resourcing partner. And my aspiration, my absolute, must achieve, I felt, was that we want these guys to be operating like regular members of the team. We want them to feel, I like to operate teams where everybody has a very high degree of empowerment and autonomy, but that comes, the flip side of that is accountability. So that classic, management upwards. I don't want to be helicoptering over your shoulder because, why hire someone and try and do the work yourself? But at the same time, I do need you to put the hand up and flag up early when something's maybe going wrong. And not for a, it's not a blame culture thing. I want people to be free to make mistakes, but the flip side of that is that there needs to be some learning off the back end of that mistake so that we don't make the same mistake twice.
What out of interest, with that, because what was the biggest challenge? Like you said mass scale engagement with a third party outsourced partner. That's like challenging, right? What was the?
So I think there were 3 big challenges. The first is quality of candidates. If you're going that big, all of these people operate a bench to some degree, but that bench is not going to be statistically big enough that you'll be able to fish 60 people off it who meet your quality criteria. And then now that could be because we had relatively high standards, but why shouldn't you? That's problem number 1. Problem number 2, I think, is that culture piece. And I think if you've been in, and I shouldn't perhaps speak for them, but I think if you've been in an augmentation partner for a long time and you have been used as a body shop for a long time, the perception I got was that it was quite uncomfortable for people to sort of spread their wings and exercise the freedom that we were trying to give them, because it was unfamiliar to them. And there's a comfort in sitting in a very hierarchical organization where the guy above you tells you what to do because the girl above him's told him what to do, and there's a chain of, well, it's come all the way from so and so it must be the right thing, and if it goes wrong, we just pass it up the chain and then it gets sorted out. And I think if you take all of those, I think they're perceived as safeguards. If you take all of those away because you want people to be free to innovate, and maybe find their own solutions to the problems, I think they can be quite scary. And just feel really uncomfortable. So, that's why, well, from my perspective, you use your existing team, and this is why you get that hit in productivity I was talking about, to really, build around them. And then the third challenge, I guess, is just onboarding. Onboarding is satisfying. Onboarding is difficult with 1 or 2 people at a time, I think. I think there's I've spoken, I think, to you about this before. I think there's a general perception that when somebody leaves a business, okay, well, you've probably got 2 months where they're maybe checked out a little bit, and then you've got another couple of months while you're waiting for the next person to come on board, and then you've got maybe 6 months while you're waiting for them to become fully effective. So, you've effectively down a productive resource for, let's say, 12 months, but you can measure it, so you can see that it's going in the right direction. Doing that with 50, 60 people, bringing them on board, that's that
when
is
you put it like that, it's really scary, that, isn't it? I mean, that's
yeah, and that's where I was fortunate that I had a really strong team of principal engineers on this project, and one of them came up with was really passionately championed the idea of mob programming, which is, I don't know if you've come across it, but it's like pair programming in the round. So you might have 20, 30, 40 people on a call. That's an interesting sell to the business because, if they're digging that deep into it and you're telling them, okay, well, for the first, I don't know, maybe 10 things that we do with this team, we're going to have 30 people all working on the same thing. That's quite a thing to ask for. Just brought all these people on and they're only delivering one thing between them. But I think and not just in the onboarding phase, I think, getting the mob up and running at regular intervals so that, people get topped up and refreshed is so helpful because you're effectively achieving all the things we've just spoken about, but live. So you're immersing them in our team's development culture. You are empowering them because at some point through that mob session, every one of them is going to get a turn driving, and everyone's going to get a turn coding. So it really forces the whole speak up issue. There's no hiding behind the keyboard or the stand up. But also I think it's a really efficient way of downloading the same piece of knowledge into 30, 40 heads in one go. I talked about living documentation, and one of the things, I'm a fan of is making sure we've got documentation as close to the code base as possible, but also having a good backup repository of knowledge. So something like Confluence, I think, is key. Or, if you're in a front-end space, having a design system component library that allows people to go in and play with the components and see how they work and operate them in the wild. But at some point, there's no real substitute for having somebody who's an expert in this and knows how it works, just tell you how it works and show you how it works. And what I liked about the mob programming was I wasn't having to get a principal engineer to sit down with 30 people one-on-one to run them through the same induction. We were sort of doing it en masse. And what's also nice is that, okay, so I might be on the induction learning the new system. I might have a question, but I might not be comfortable asking that question. But with 30, 40 of you on the call, there's a good chance somebody else will be. And that also, I think that builds the confidence in the respectful questioning culture. I think that's, for me, that's one of the key things in that whole manage upwards philosophy. There's no, as long as it's done respectfully, there's no stupid question or there's no unwanted challenge. I might come to a problem thinking I know what the answer is, but I know what I think the answer is based on my experience, which is not infinite. That's why you have a team. That's why you have, one thing that I was thinking about the other day was diversity of thought. I want people who think a bit different from me. Otherwise, we're just going to produce the same solutions over and over again.
Totally. And actually, it must be fascinating to watch that unfold as they're sort of in that environment, that kind of mob coding culture.
It's hilarious because you start off and you think, oh God, this is a car crash. This really isn't working. Nobody wants to talk. It's the same three people just contributing over and over again. And then at some point, that sort of threshold of psychological safety kicks in, and suddenly people just start chipping in, and it's great. It's sort of like, it's like taking the training wheels off and watching them actually go for it for the first time, and it does work.
How long do you run that over? Like, is it half a day, a day? What are they, workshops?
Yeah, well, I think the shortest we've done is probably a couple of hours.
Right.
And it really, so the key to it is, and maybe we should have gone back and talked a bit about agile ceremony as well, but at some point you will have arrived at a story, a piece of work that needs to be done. And, maybe, I'm just trying to think if we ever did a mob session on refinements analysis, probably not, but I think probably the minimum requirement is that you go into this session with a story, with some fleshed out requirements, and somebody on the call who knows how or has an opinion as to how to do this and knows enough about the systems that they could do this. And then you basically set out the problem, set out the areas of the stack we're going to look at. You'll sort of sketch a thumbnail of what you think the solution is, and then you just start working on it. So you can do it in a couple of hours. You can do it I don't think you'd want to do it more than 4 hours. That feels like a bit of a chore. But you could do a couple of sessions a day. I don't see why not. I think you want to hit that. There's that magical attention span limit, isn't there, where you just need a break, you get a bit tired, you need to go focus on something else. So 2-3 hours probably feels like the right sort of time limit for that.
I'm conscious I've kept you for a while, but I mean, I know there's so many other things we could talk about. If you were to leave us kind of with one last snippet, if you were wanting to give a piece of advice or maybe a big thing you'd learned you changed from scaling before, what would that be?
I can think of a couple. You can never start early enough. That feels like a trite thing to say, but yeah, that's terrifyingly true. For all the reasons we discussed about, finding a partner, finding the resources, getting them up to speed. I think if you are going to scale fast and big and go with an augmentation partner, the key is in the word augmentation. One of the things that I found really successful was in structuring the team, making sure, and we could talk about, how you structure the team around the architecture and making sure that people don't trip over each other. That's probably another gotcha. But one of the things for me that's an absolute must is each team needs to be what I'll call cross-functional, so able to operate across whatever slice of the stack you've given them, but they need to be blended. You don't want to be in a situation where you've got a purely augmentation sourced team, because even though you want them to get to the point where they can operate at that level, the reality is that that kind of value is not going to pay back in under 12 months. And if you step back too quickly, you're just setting that team up for failure and they're just going to drown. I think one of the big takeaways from me was don't be too precious about, let's say, what should we call command and control structure. Don't be too precious about leadership. You want, when you're scaling at that kind of size, for every, let's call them engineering leaders, whether they're principal engineers or team leads or whatever, for every one of those you've got in a squad in-house, I would say you want to be identifying someone of a similar level of ability in the augmentation partner.
Right.
So if I've got 5 squads and I've got 5 in-house principal engineers, I want 5 engineering leads from my augmentation partner in each squad. And you want to buddy them up. And, you want to set up like maybe not a peer relationship, but certainly a sort of mentoring relationship between the two. And I would say that is where you should invest your time in finding the resources in those leaders, because you could sit and screen, and I did try and sit and screen 60 candidates, but it's just not scalable. One of the things that you can do, and we did do, and I thought was really effective, is if you find those 5 people who are really, really good, you then empower them to go and find the members of their team within the augmentation partner. Obviously, you get a chance to screen them, but it's a much quicker screening. It's a sense check, and you get a little printout of their experience and where they've been and what they can do. And that person fits the bill. No, that person's too far away from the spec. And then once they've found their team, you maybe have a half-hour conversation with them. But building that level of accountability and also that level of empowerment in that sort of paired leader on the augmentation side, that then sets you up for all the things we talked about earlier, creating that empowered organization, and creating an organization where your augmentation resources operate the same way as your in-house ones do. So that's really, I think, if you're building for long-term success, that's the only way you avoid burnout from your in-house resources, because nobody wants to be hand-holding 60 people for 2.5 years.
No.
But at the same time, you do need to keep an eye on that. You shouldn't be afraid to every 3 months, every 6 months, sit down and say, okay, who's not really performing in the augmentation, as you would do with your in-house resources.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. The leadership piece I found very interesting, and that makes complete sense because they kind of their team success and their team's work has basically been handpicked by them and chosen by them for their success or not. So it gives a lot more accountability. But
well, the thing I've always tried to answer, and it's a problem with contractors as well, is if you're not an in-house employee, you're by definition not expecting to be around for the long run. Yeah. So how do you generate the level of, let's call it ownership and sort of pride in what you're working on? If well, I'm here for 6 months and I'm on to the next thing. I just don't feel that lends itself to the same, this is my baby. I've shepherded it into existence. Please don't break it. There is a toxic flip side to that, but hopefully you have good safeguards in place to make sure you never get there. But I think what I tried to address with that sort of local empowerment was trying to replicate that, and we had some success. Replicate that level of ownership and pride in. I haven't just been fed work off a sausage machine and built this stuff. I've thought about this. I've come up with solutions. I've had my solutions checked off by architects or by the principals, and they've been happy with what I've proposed, and we've gone through peer review, and my code's okay, it's been tweaked or it's been accepted. But it's just all the time giving that crucial feedback to those augmentation resources that it's not just put requirements in here, work comes out the end. You are part of the process. I think one of the worst outcomes you can get is where you try and implement that, and then at some point, whoever's on the receiving end of the peer review just rips it all up and codes it themselves. That's, unfortunately, I don't think that's unavoidable. I think that can happen with the best will in the world, but you on a year-long project with that many people, you want to see that maybe once, and maybe quite early on.
It's one of those things, as I said, we could have a whole topic of discussion around leadership and peer review and mentoring. For me, any organizer, that's where it starts, and how well you can integrate those teams, integrate those people, and kind of have that working relationship where they're as productive as possible and efficient as possible. And it's an issue, as I said, I hadn't thought of it from the point of view of making them responsible for their own team out there, of hiring them and having a matching, local and third-party leadership group is interesting. Tim, look, I really appreciate you joining me. It's been great. Maybe I feel like we've got another episode in us about this with the topics we haven't covered on some of this. But thank you very much.
Pleasure.
And hopefully everyone can join us again on another episode of Talk.